Perhaps nowhere on earth has there ever been a group of people more versatile than the monks of Europe. They were physicians and scholars and agriculturists and inventors. And they, perhaps more than any other group, is responsible for helping to save Western civilization. Let's talk about that today on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome once again to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Today it's the monks who helped to save Western civilization. Now there's a small publishing industry out there of books called How So-and-so Saved Civilization. This group saved it, and that group saved it. The monks deserve this title, ladies and gentlemen, the monks. Even the Irish, who are sometimes credited with saving civilization, did so in large part because of their monks. Who were these people, after all? They were monks. Well, I don't want to assume any prior knowledge. Who are the monks? What are they doing? And how did they save Western civilization? We already see in the 3rd century a tradition whereby women religious, we would call them, began to live together and share the same spiritual and prayer life and dedicated themselves to the care of the poor and the sick. So it's very easy to see in that the tradition of convents and the life of the nun. Also in the 3rd century we see a tradition among men to be hermits. The hermits were people who forsook everything, who pursued absolute solitude in order better to commune with God and to hear Him and to pray to Him. St. Anthony of the Desert in the mid-3rd century was a classic example of this. He lived to be over 100 years old, and he went out into the deserts of Egypt. The hermits typically lived completely alone. They would gather on Sundays to worship God, but otherwise they kept to themselves. And they tended small vegetable gardens to support themselves, or they made baskets, but otherwise theirs was a life of extreme solitude. Now, in a certain sense, this is all well and good, and the Church has never altogether repudiated the tradition of hermit life. In fact, she's had a pope who was a hermit in the 1290s, Pope Celestine V. But right away, there were critics of the hermit's life, because the hermit, who lived apart from anyone who could provide him spiritual guidance, sometimes engaged in spiritual practices that were, well, rather questionable. Some of them engaged in, shall we say, penances that were exaggerated, or some of them would go out of their way to wait until food rotted before they would eat it. And this type of thing would go on, and a good many Catholics began to argue that this is not a healthy thing. This is not what God intends. This is not what Christ is calling you to. For example, in the Christian East, St. Basil the Great repeatedly said that the life of the hermit is not the Christian one, ideally, because what we should be doing is living among our fellow human beings, ideally. That would be the best solution. The monks should live in solitude, but in a sense a kind of communal solitude, with other monks, with other people who have in effect retreated from the world. Now it's important to understand the monks are not saying that the world is evil, therefore we retreat from it, or that spaghetti and meatballs and an ice cream sundae are all evil, so therefore I want to deprive myself of them and eat more simply. To the contrary, because Catholics believe in the goodness of the created world, what the monks are saying is that the world is wonderful, it's a great thing, it's filled with a great many delights, and that's why it's such a sacrifice for us to give them up to show how much we love God. One of my friends has sometimes explained it this way: it's one thing to bring flowers for your wife. It's quite another to bring her flowers on a rainy, miserable day, when she knows it was just an unbelievable ordeal for you to get those flowers and get back in the car and keep the vase from spilling over in the car. I've had plenty of experience with this, folks. This is exactly why the monks made sacrifices, to show how much they loved God. In the West, it was a man named Saint Benedict who argued that we need to have monks who live in a single place, and they live together, and they have the same spiritual regimen, and they live under the authority of an abbot. St. Benedict composed something called the Rule of St. Benedict, which was in effect an outline for how a monastery should be run. He wrote this around 529, and with the passage of time, this became the model for organizing monasteries. A monastery, of course, is where the monks live. And St. Benedict argued that the monks should live penitential lives, it's true, but not lives that are so penitential that it would disrupt their spiritual lives. We don't want that. We want them to live at the material level of about the average Italian peasant. That would be acceptable. They should get adequate sleep. They shouldn't do too much physical labor. They should be moderate in all things. Physical labor and prayer and study, and nothing out of moderation. The monasteries in Ireland were quite another story. There, the model, in effect, was working 14 hours a day, doing back-breaking labor, and then coming in and praying all the psalms. And this, it seemed to St. Benedict, was just too much, that you couldn't live a healthy spiritual life if you were being that rigorous with your physical body. Now, it should be mentioned, by the way, that the Irish monasteries attracted people from all over. They couldn't house them all, so they must have been doing something right. But this was St. Benedict's model. It was flexible, and it seemed to understand human nature very well. And it turns out that St. Benedict and his monks played an essential role in saving Western civilization at a critical moment and building up important parts of it. And yet, I will never forget, in my days as a professor in New York, after telling my class all about the monks and all the things they had done, I actually had a student say to me, "That's very interesting. Are there any monks today?" Well, that's just depressing, right? That she didn't even know there were still monks today. And so of course I told her, not only are there monks, I've got a million friends who are monks. I realize that's perhaps somewhat unusual, but I have a great many friends who are monks. And let me tell you something, living in Manhattan as I did while I was getting my doctorate, you find that just about anything can go on in Manhattan. Nobody cares. Nobody's looking at you. You can have a weird haircut. Nobody cares. You could be on fire. Nobody cares. But I had a friend of mine who was on his way to becoming a monk. He hadn't taken his vows yet, and he came and visited me in his habit. And we went out for nachos at a local place. And I'll tell you, people will look away at anything, but if you're having nachos with a monk, they cannot take their eyes off it, apparently. This is just a bizarre sight, even for Manhattan. So, unfortunately, the monks don't have the high profile they once did, but they deserve our respect. Because, after all, what did the monks accomplish? Well, for one thing, apart from just copying texts, which we all know they did that laboriously, but they also did a lot of physical labor. For example, they cleared and reclaimed all kinds of land in Western Europe. Because what often happened is that people wanted to donate land to the monks as a good work. That's wonderful. Look at what I'm doing for the monks. But people would typically give the monks really crummy land. They want to help them, but they don't want to help them that much. So the monks often found themselves having to deal with land nobody really wanted. And a lot of times it was swampland. In those days, I mean, obviously a swamp has no value. It's just a source of pestilence. The monks would dike and drain the swamp and make it into fertile land. And a great many experts on the history of agriculture in Western Europe have said, for example, we owe the agricultural restoration of a great part of Europe to the monks. Another one said, wherever they came, they converted the wilderness into a cultivated country. They pursued the breeding of cattle and agriculture, labored with their own hands, drained morasses and cleared away forests. By them, Germany was rendered a fruitful country. And finally, every Benedictine monastery was an agricultural college for the whole region in which it was located. The monks introduced crops and industries and production methods that people hadn't known before. And they weren't afraid to work with their hands at a time when manual labor was looked down upon and despised. The monks were inspired to engage in physical labor because they knew, for one thing, that when you engage in hard physical labor, this can be a great form of penance and an opportunity for the mortification of the flesh. So sure, they were thrilled to work with the swamp that nobody else wanted to do. So at a time when you were despised for doing physical labor, the monks, in effect, made it something honorable. At a time when agriculture was collapsing, the monks' labor helped to bring it back. The monks were involved in rearing cattle and horses, brewing beer, raising bees and fruit. And all over Europe, they introduced essential aspects of local economies. For example, in Sweden, it was the corn trade that owed its existence to the monks. In Parma, cheese making. In Ireland, salmon fisheries. And in a great many places, the finest vineyards. The monks were also intensely practical in that they stored up the waters from springs in order so that they could distribute them if a drought ever struck. In Lombardy, the peasants learned irrigation from the monks. The monks have also been credited with being the first to work toward improving breeds of cattle instead of just leaving the process to chance. So there's agricultural labor from the monks at a critical time in European history. With the Roman Empire collapsed, the monks show up and do all this critical work. Beyond that, the monks pioneered in machinery and mechanization. The ancient world of Greece and Rome was not particularly heavily mechanized, but Europe of the Middle Ages changed all that. Particularly the Cistercians, which were a reform-minded group of monks from the late 11th century, they built water-powered factories at hundreds of their 742 monasteries around by the 12th century. They used water power for all kinds of purposes, for crushing wheat and fulling cloth and tanning. Far more mechanized were they than anything that had ever been seen in Europe up to that time. They were also great metallurgists. They used the slag from their furnaces as fertilizer. So they were constantly thinking of practical things they could do for the life of Europe. And they instructed Europeans as to how they themselves could do these things. They were also technologically advanced in practical things like clocks. The first clock we have any record of was built by the future Pope Silvestre II in 996, but much more sophisticated clocks were built in the 14th century. But it's not just clocks, and it's not just agriculture. It's charity and education and inventiveness. All these things we're going to look at as soon as we come back from the break. So join me after the break, and let's talk more about these monks.